All right, next we will be encountering Module 4, the lead and copper rule. Module 4, lead and copper rule. Our terminal objective here is to hopefully be able to define lead and copper once we've complete this module. We're going to look at the regulatory overview of the rule itself, describe the health effects of lead and copper, and we'll talk about sampling, which a lot of us are probably doing. How do we sample? What bottles do we use? Is there any preservative? Do we allow our customers to pull the samples? And then we'll define the action levels for lead and copper. We will identify examples of public education, and that goes into what are we going to tell the consumer to do in order to reduce the amount of lead and copper they may be exposed to. And we'll discuss various lead and copper treatment options. When there is a problem, how do we rectify? How do we get it out of our system? When you look at the regulatory overview of lead and copper, it was developed to protect public health by minimizing the exposure to lead and copper. Now my question is, how does lead and copper get into our drinking water?
Through the
Plumbing and piping, absolutely. Especially in the early years. A lot of our fixtures and things, lead, solder, and flux, the copper piping. And what happens over time, the water is stagnant in these pipes, then those contaminants can leach into your water source. And so by utilizing water that's been in the line long periods of time, you're going to get an increased amount of lead and copper. Now, so the most common source, as you all told me, was corrosion of your plumbing material. Many of your plumbing materials were made with lead and copper. All the fixtures, the piping, the faucets, the solder and flux, again, lead and copper based there. So the lead and copper rule was introduced in the early 1990s. It established the action level of lead at 15 parts per billion, or 0.1 parts per million, or for copper 1.3 milligram per liter, or 1,300 parts per billion. Now the key is when you go back and see what EPA prefers to see numbers as whole numbers. And so in some of your books, they'll show the action level for lead as 0.015, which is what you told me. But for reporting purpose, again, whole, and that's why we see the 15 parts per billion. That is so sweet, thank you, for lead, because they like to see it in whole numbers. Now the action level is based on the 90th percentile level, and we'll show you how do you calculate the 90th percentile. No more than 10% of your samples can be above that action level, and if it is found above the level, it does not signal a violation because these are action levels. They're not maximum contaminant level. So what happens when it's above that, it just simply says now you have to do additional treatment in order to get the water below that action level. In addition to the additional treatment, we're on Module 4, you're going to also have to do additional analysis, and we quantify these as water quality parameters. So now I got to start looking at not only lead and copper, but pH, corrosion inhibitors, conductivity. So there are several water quality parameters that we'll be monitoring. The other component of this rule, once it exceeds the 90th percentile, I have to look at treatment technologies that will reduce corrosion, and so it may be mandated to do some type of corrosion treatment. Source water monitoring, and we talked about source water assessment earlier, so that's another component of the lead and copper, as well as public education. And in the early years, when the rule first came out in 1991, EPA mandated that if the system was at fault and there was a problem with the lines, that the systems had to replace no fewer than 7% of the lines per year. That was the other component there. Now, Past application, why we use lead and copper so much in the past was, bottom line, it was cheap. Very, very cheap and readily available. And so that's why we have so much of it in the ground even today. Lead exposure primarily caused developmental problems in children. In essence, some of you all may have heard it dumbs us down. It messes with our mental capabilities and abilities there. Copper is more of a gastrointestinal type of a disability there. And also it increased the effects from other contaminants. For instance, if I have high levels of nitrites and nitrates, it's going to, with copper there, it's going to increase those levels. And if you remember from earlier, nitrates and nitrites are on our primary drinking water. Why are we concerned with nitrates and nitrites? Did any of you all read what it was from? The contaminant source? All right, you say yes, so what was it from and what does it do? Blue baby syndrome. Very good, blue baby syndrome. And again, we're getting it from our fertilizers, from agriculture, from runoff, from our wastewater streams into our drinking water source. And for the very young, their bodies, although oxygen is present, nitrogen is present, but their body will prefer the nitrogen over the oxygen. And what happens when their red blood cells don't get the oxygen? They turn blue because of suffocation, because there's no oxygen in the blood. And when copper, increased amount of copper is in our water, plus the nitrate, it's going to increase that effect of that particular contaminant. So the purpose of the lead and copper rule, number one, is to minimize exposure. How do we minimize exposure to the average Joe Blow and Sally Sue, and to minimize the effect from drinking the water? Now, the rule was promulgated in 1991. That's when we first saw the rule. In 2007, there were minor revisions to the rule. The goal of the rule was to provide maximum health protection from lead and copper, and this rule was established for community water systems as well as non-community water systems. What is a community water system? Okay, he said a water system with its own networks of line. I'm taking a test. Will that be acceptable?
No, 25 people.
Okay, very good. We're on the right track. We're serving 25 individuals or,
For 6 months.
okay, and the key here will be community. Community. So start off at the top. Public water system, because that's where Danielle started. We'll start where you are. A public water system has at least 15 service connections or 25 individuals for at least 60 days of a year. That's a public. Every water system falls up under the umbrella of the public water system. Underneath that umbrella, we have community water systems and we have non-community water systems. So let's start with non-community water systems. We still have a minimum of 15 service connections, 25 individuals, for at least 6 months out of the year. I can serve or provide them with water for public consumption for more than 6 months, but a minimum of 6 months. So of those types of non-community systems, they can be transient, they can be non-transient. The difference between the two, if it's a transient system, I have people, 25 individuals, that are not the same individual that are coming and going. So an example of a transient system would be,
Like a restaurant.
okay, restaurants, okay, very good. Hotels, motels, very good, very good. Now, I have the non-transient, non-community water system, and that's that second one there, non-community water system, non-transient one. These are 25 of the same individuals for at least 6 months. Give me an example of a non-transient
Like
community water system.
Like a workplace.
Like a factory, 25 of the same individual. A rural school, Yeah, very good, very good. Now, community water system, which was the other major subtopic under the public water system. 15 service connections or 25 individuals. The key there, I'm providing water for human consumption on a year-round basis. That's 365 days. Questions? Clear? So when you look at the different types of water system, it's mainly based on the days of service. Public water system, that's what everybody has to meet at a minimum, 60 days out of the year, 15 service connections, 25 individuals. Okay? Underneath the public, now we have it further broken down, community, non-community. Non-community, a minimum of 6 months. Community, a minimum year-round basis. Providing piped water for human consumption. Okay, so with the lead and copper, we're looking at community water systems and the non-community water systems there, as far as the ones that have to do the actual analysis. Health effects of lead and copper. Why are we concerned with these two? Well, for infants and young children, the blue baby syndrome. Again, magnification of nitrite ingestion. Also gastrointestinal problems with the exposure to copper. Adults, gastrointestinal effects also. For lead, if you're looking at the very young, 9 times out of 10 when there's an exposure to levels above the action level, we see low birth rate, slowdown of mental or physical development, damages hearing, it's a reduction to the attention span, and poor classroom performance. So lead can do quite a lot. Adults, which was quite interesting, kidney damage, increased blood pressure. How many of us are on blood pressure medication? Could it be the exposure to lead in drinking water? Okay. Damage to reproductive systems. So these are real health effects that are of great concern. Now, every report, once you run the analysis for lead and copper, every report must include a short informational statement. In other words, they want you to let the public know that the very young and your pregnant women are more susceptible to the effects of lead and copper in the drinking water, more so than the general population. Also, you want to make sure the public know that elevated levels can lead to serious health problems for pregnant women and young children. And it comes from, again, your house plumbing is the bottom line. Other informational statements that are included in the report is sort of like the educational component of it. If I know that lead or copper is leaching into the water because of stagnant water, what's the number one thing we're going to tell people to do? Okay, flush. Turn on the water first thing in the morning, let it run a minimum of 2 minutes or until there's a temperature change. When there's a temperature change, I know all that stagnant water has been flushed out. That's a good rule there. If you're concerned about the level still, you want to give the information to your public. Where can they go to have their water tested or in order to seek medical attention? There's even a hotline for the Safe Drinking Water Act that you can refer them to, that they can, call for more information. And also let them know that because homes were built at different times in your community, your house may be a hot spot, your house may be okay. Okay. The system can also write its own educational statement as long as it's approved by your territory or the EPA. So let's look at what we're going to do for sampling for lead and copper. Specific instruction for sampling and testings include, number one, you have to select your sample points. You can't go willy-nilly and go out there and decide, I'm collecting from Mickey House here, and the next go around I'm going to collect from Frank. No, you have to have an approved program in place where you've identified what testing sites you're going to use. You're going to submit that to your territory for approval, or the EPA, whoever your primacy agent is, for approval for those testing sites. Another key component would be collection of samples. Now you can do one or two things here. You can talk with your homeowners, get them to buy in and pull the samples for you, or you can pull them. Now one of the things EPA says here, if you allow homeowners to pull samples, you cannot then go back and say it's not valid because they were not trained on how to pull the samples. So it's going to be up to you to educate your homeowner how to pull the samples. Why are we concerned with homeowners pulling samples, and why do we want them to pull samples? That's what we're testing. We're actually testing the plumbing to see whether or not we have hits there. With lead and copper, analyzing the samples, you've got to send it to a certified lab, which is usually the state lab or an approved lab to run the analysis. Now the size of your water system, as we talked about with coliform, size of the system will determine the number of samples that are required. For instance, and I think you have this in your book on page, there you go, 4-6. And did I have the paper? You all tell me you have 60,000. So you would be considered a large system. So the number of initial lead and copper tap sampling sites for you was about 60. Does that sound about right, Danielle?
Yes.
Okay. Now, after that first round and everything came back hanky-dory, A-OK, no hits, then you could request to be put on reduced monitoring. Reduced monitoring for a system your size, cut in half, 30 samples instead of the 60. So you all did achieve the reduced Okay, very good. So you went up initially, now you're back down on the reduced monitoring. All right, in addition to your lead and copper samples, the number of water quality parameter tap sample sites for the initial round, 10. And for the reduced monitoring requirement, that was reduced to about 7.
What is that? WQP?
That's the water quality analysis that you must do. If you flip on page 410, it tells you exactly the tests that you're looking for. You're doing pH, alkalinity, dose rate, concentration if necessary, corrosion inhibitor. Those are all the additional analysis that you should be doing on certain number of taps. And that's even if you're on the reduced monitoring. So usually the laboratory will take care of those analyses, and you're shaking your head, no, you don't know about those? You're not checking for that to be done? With your lead and copper, that's part of the lead and copper requirement there. You think they're doing it? You may want to check into that and make sure you're getting results on those, because even if it's on the reduced, you still got to meet those criterias and frequencies there. Now, if you're doing any type of corrosion treatment, those WQP samples are done every 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks. Yeah. Okay. And otherwise every 6 months. All right, now the short-term revision, again, 2007 is when you had some revisions to the lead and copper rule. One of the main thing was your taps that you're going to sample from must be taps that are used for human consumption. That's critical. And usually that refers to kitchen or bathroom sinks or taps. In other words, I can't go outside the house and pull a lead and copper sample. Okay. Must be, again, where is this water going to be used? Is it used for human consumption? So that was a big revision there. It has to be a tap that's used for human consumption. If your system has fewer than 5 taps, you're going to sample all taps at least once. You don't have that situation because you got 60,000 plus. So I know you have a minimum, you've identified 60 sampling taps already, just because of the sheer number of people that you have. Now, your primacy agency, if you had fewer than that, had the discretion to allow the systems with fewer than 5 to collect 1 sample from each tap that can be used for human consumption. But again, you have to put in a special request. That's not applicable to you because of your size. All right, the other short-term revision, 2007. System with fewer than 5 samples are required to use the highest test result as the 90th percentile. Earlier we showed you where they would allow you to use the average. If you have fewer than 5, you're using the 90th. 5 samples, you're using the average. 10 samples, you're using the 9th sample. 20th samples, again, there are different criteria. So that was another revision. The other amendments was in 2007, it allows for reduction to lead and copper sampling frequency to 1 per year. And that is if all of your lead and copper came out below the 90th percentile. So instead of twice a year or every 6 months, you have the right to reduce to once a year there. Are you all doing any once a year? Or are you still doing the semi-annual? Or quarterly?
Once every 3 years.
Once every 3 years. So you're on a further. Very good. So you've gotten around even that second round of testing. Excellent. So you're on that third one, reduction to once every 3 years, which means you had no major problems whatsoever.
We only have one system
That's still on the, okay, higher frequency. Is it quarterly? Or 6 months? So that's not so bad because there are some systems that are doing it quarterly. Yeah. Okay, excellent. So yeah, it can be very expensive. So once every 3 years, that shows that you have the situation in hand. All right. Now I won't even go through this because you're not even collecting 5 samples. Let me go to the one with at least 10 samples. Okay. So here would be an example of a system if you're collecting, and this is not your book, but just how do you get the 90th percentile. If you're collecting 10 samples, again, you're going to order your results from the lowest to the highest, as you've done here. And as you can see, the lowest is 0.005, the highest being 0.04. And this is for lead. Now, right away, because I have that 0.04, the 0.02, right away, I'm thinking what? I've exceeded it. But you can do the calculations to see. In this case, I'm going to look at, wrong button. Once I've done that, multiply your number of samples by 0.9 to determine which one represents the 90th. And in this case, since I have 10 samples, it's going to be my 9th sample.
We do have systems where we only take 5 samples.
You do, so you want to see that. Okay. Go back.
Like Numa.
All right, so if your system is doing 5 samples, I'm still doing step 1, order them from lowest to highest, and then multiply by the 0.9 to determine the 90th percentile. And in this case, when I multiply by 0.9, 5 samples times 0.9 gives me what? 4.5. Well, I don't have a 4.5 sample. That's where you're taking the average of the 4th and 5th sample. So you have to take that midpoint at that point. So you will average the 4th and 5th in order to get the 4.51. So once I've averaged the 4th and 5th sample, now my 4th sample was 0.011, my 5th sample 0.020. I add them together, divide by 2, and I get what? Iva or Eva? Which one is it? Eva. I get 0.0155. What is my action level for lead? 0.015. Have I exceeded my action level?
Yeah.
Yeah, that extra 5 on there? Yeah. Yeah, and if you round, that's 0.02. I've exceeded. And that's what this is saying. Once you compare that to your action level, if it exceeded and 0.0155 is greater than 0.015, it's an exceedance. And so now I have to go into that additional analysis and water quality parameter testing every 2 weeks once I have my corrosion correction treatment in place. Okay? The 10 samples works the same way. And this, the ninth highest was my action level, which was 0.02, if you remember it. And of course, 0.02 exceeds the 0.015, so I have an exceedance here. If you had 20 samples, what would you do? 20 times 0.9 gives me 18, right? So my 18th sample would be my 90th percentile. That's the one I will compare. So this shows you can have those ones that will spike up, but is that particular sample greater than your action level determines whether or not you've exceeded. Does it make sense? Okay, good. And you're going to do the same for copper. And with coppers, your numbers are usually a lot higher than lead, but it's the same process of analysis. Now, you have 3 tiers of sampling. That's the other thing that's critical with the lead and copper. What do we mean by 3 tiers of sampling? They want you to go and find, when you're developing your siting plan, remember, I can't just say, okay, Mickey, I'm going to collect from you this time, Frank from you that time. No, my sampling sites must meet certain criteria. What does EPA says? One would be Tier 1 site. These are single family structures that contain copper pipes, lead solder installed after 1982 and served by a lead service line. That's Tier 1. Tier 2 would be your multifamily or your buildings. And again, contain copper pipe, lead solder, installed after 1982 and or served by a lead service line. And then we have Tier 3. These are single family structures with copper pipes, lead solder installed prior to 1983. So you have to make sure, again, you're choosing your sites based on those tiers.
So we've done, we were first starting to do lead copper sampling. We went out initially and did surveys in these villages, and we found that while there were some homes built before these years, none of their plumbing was
Okay, met the criteria of the sites. Okay.
we just did like, okay, your house.
Okay. And one of the things that you can do also when you find that situation, and you can always refer back to the quick reference guides, what EPA says, because it's almost like the asbestos rule. Everybody is testing for asbestos. However, if I don't have any AC pipe, why am I testing for asbestos? You can initiate the process of getting a waiver or an exemption. It does not exempt you totally from doing it, but it does give you a wider frequency of doing the analysis. Okay? So an exemption, you can apply for an exemption in cases like that. When you can prove it, you have to do the process of proving we have no copper pipes or we did not use the lead, solder, and flux, in our plumbing systems. And once you can prove that, you can apply for the exemptions. They give you that option to do that. Now, if you had non-transient, non-community systems, remember these were the other ones that had to fall on it. You want to use only Tier 1 or Tier 3 for sampling selection. In other words, only single families. none of the multi-family or the buildings, okay, for your non-transient, non-community system. All right, now, once you've, as Danielle said, she said, we're going to do you, since we're not finding any that meet the criteria. Once you've developed the sample siting plan, you must submit that to your territory for their approval, or EPA for their approval. And again, you got to make sure you've done due diligence and you have a backup as to why you've selected these sites. 50% of your samples collected during the initial or each monitoring period must be from sites that contain lead pipes or copper pipes, and 50% served by a lead service line. This was the initial criteria for the initial round of sampling. Now, as far as sample collection, we go back to what the EPA regs are for sample collection, and we're following their approved method. Keep in mind, when you're doing any type of analysis for reporting, it must be from an approved method. So we're going to utilize CFR 141.86 for collection procedures. Very important, because you see this on almost every exam. I don't care what state, territory, it's the same, it's redundancy. We're going to pull first draw sample. In other words, we do not flush, we don't let it run till first draw. We want to know what's stagnant in that line. Has copper, has lead leached out into that water as it was stagnant? That's what we're trying to prove. So if you let it run, you've just messed the sampling up. So again, your water should be motionless in your plumbing system at least 6 hours, no more than 18 hours. Now here's the other thing. You can ask people to pull it the first thing in the morning, or you can ask people to pull it the first thing after work, if the water has been motionless for at least 6 hours. But we can't have homeowners midday remembering, oh, I forgot to pull that sample, let me go pull that sample, and they've cooked breakfast, they've bathed, they've done it all. Collect from the cold water tap. Not hot, but cold. Very important. Now, the lab may acidify the sample the bottle prior to collection, but because we are allowing homeowners to collect to reduce the liability, EPA has given laboratories the authority not to put that acid in there, because that's the last thing you want, is a homeowner being hurt because of the acid that's in the bottle. So because of that, the method does allow for preserving the sample up to 14 days after collecting. And that's very important. If you're going to let homeowners, make sure there's no acid in that bottle. That's a safety hazard you don't want. Systems may not challenge results if the residents are allowed to pool samples. And I don't know how you all do it here, but in Houston, operators are not allowed to go in the house. They can take the bottle up to the house, but the customer must pull, and that's just an internal policy that we have. It may be different here. You all can go into the homes and actually pull the samples. It's whatever your utility policy is. Okay, collect a tap after flushing the volume of water between the tap and lead service line when you are collecting lead service line samples. This is different from the tap, though. In other words, if I want that water from that lead service line, and that lead service line is actually out there on the other side of the road, I need to make sure I'm flushing enough water where I'm pulling the water that's stagnant in that line out there. Does that make sense? So if I have one of these as my sampling sites, which they said the initial round, 50% had to come from this type of sampling site. Flushing is part of the SOP for collecting this sample, and that's critical. You can go and tap directly into the lead service line, and that is recommended. Set up your own sampling sites. Tap into that line where you don't have to do the flushing. Single family residents allow the water to run until there is a change in temperature. Now I know I'm getting the water from that lead service line. So all of these, not only are you going to verbally give the instructions to your homeowners, I'd put it in writing too, so they can have something to refer back to, depending on what type of sample they're pulling. Now for your small or medium systems, EPA says a small system is what size population?
3,300.
3,300, very good. So then my medium would be that 3,301 to 10,000. So for small and medium systems that exceed the action level, they must monitor the following at the taps and entry points to the distribution system. This is where the water quality parameters come in. This is what they say. If you've exceeded, you must begin this analysis here. pH, alkalinity, orthophosphate or silica inhibitors are used, calcium, conductivity, water temperature. Now why are these parameters, why must these parameters be monitored? What do they have to do with lead and copper? Hmm?
The characteristics of the water.
Yeah, and it makes the water what? Corrosive. So if I got a low pH and lead and copper problem, yeah, very corrosive acidic water there. Alkalinity is that buffering capacity to maintain a certain pH. So if my alkalinity is out of whack, I can't maintain the correct pH that I need, which will drop it, which again, corrosive water. Inhibitors can be used like the orthophosphate, polyphosphate, whenever we have iron and other kind of problems that makes the water corrosive. It's when you start putting those things. You're going to have to monitor what you're putting in essence. All right, and temperature is also something that affected. Question? Yes, what's your question? Okay, cool. All right, now, I've taken my first round of sampling. Everything came back below the action level. You can now qualify for reduced sampling. Okay, and that's where we all want to be. You have to be below the action level for at least 2 consecutive 6-month period. That's 2 sampling episodes. And if you're below the action level, you can be put on the reduced monitoring once per year or once every 3 years. Now, you also have to include the parameters on the previous slide just to show that everything's A-okay. So this particular chart or table is in your book. If you look on page 410, it gives us the initial monitoring period, what we're going to test for, where to test for that, and the frequency. So for initial monitoring, we're doing all those water quality parameters at the taps and entry to the distribution system, and we're doing it every 6 months. After we've run lead and copper and we have a hit, and they tell us that we have to install some type of corrosion control, then we're doing those same water quality parameters at the tap and entry into the distribution system. At the tap, we're doing it every 6 months. Into the distribution system, we're doing it every 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks. And that's when we've had a hit, when it's exceeded the 90th percentile. And it will be the same after your territory specify optimum corrosion control. If they've specified that for you for that one system, you're doing those analyses at the same frequency. Again, at the tap every 6 months, and at the entry of the distribution system every 2 weeks. Not less than every 2 weeks is what they say. Question? So Danielle's going to check to make sure that those are being taken care of for those systems there.
Yeah.
Even if you're on a reduced monitoring, it does not take you out of the game with the water quality parameters. So I'm pretty sure they're being done, because even with the reduced monitoring, we're still doing the WQPs every 6 months or 3 years if you're on the reduced frequency, but we're still doing it every 3 years. And then if you're doing any type of inhibitor corrosion control or something like that, you're doing it not less than every 2 weeks. In other words, you're just monitoring what you're putting in the system. Do you all use any type of polyphosphates or corrosion control in any of your systems? Okay, so that's not anything that's applicable to you. Okay. All right, for analyzing the lead and copper sample, again, the EPA method is 141.2223K1. And the key here is lead and copper must be conducted by a certified lab. The water quality parameters, you can do that yourselves. You can do that in-house if you so choose and you have the capabilities to do it. You don't need a certified lab in order to run those analyses. So reporting, how do we report the results that we've gotten? We've run the analysis, we've gotten our results, now we're responsible for reporting. You have to report within the first 10 days following each end of each monitoring period. So if you're doing the 6 months, what's today? Today is October the 10th. 10 days from now, gotten the results in, got to report my results there. And then depending on what frequency, could be every 6 months within the first 10 days, annually, 3 years or 9 years. There are some people that have a 9-year exemption.
Yeah, we don't know yet.
Well, who knows if you're at the 3-year now, there's a potential to get to the 9-year. All right, what else there? And again, what we're reporting is the 90th percentile concentration, the results of samples collected at entry points. Do you know what I mean when I say entry points to the distribution system? Does that make sense to you? Where is that then for you?
A well?
Is it at the well? Okay, prior to the first tap.
Yeah.
Okay. And you may have, have you put in your own sampling sites?
Sample tap and
Okay.
entry point sample tap.
Okay, that's what I want to hear you say there. Very good. I want to make sure that that's clear. And then water quality parameters during the 6-month monitoring period. So those are the results that we should be reporting. Now, we need to make sure that we notify your territory or EPA, whoever is the primacy agency, anytime there's an addition or new source of water. For instance, I heard Danielle say that they've abandoned several wells. Well, once they've identified a new source, be it another well, they have to make sure they go through the authorization notification process there. If you change the treatment, if for, let's say, I've been dosing with chlorine, now I want to use a chlorine dioxide or chloramines. Can I just do that without their authorization? Not if you want to stay in their good graces. So anytime you change any type of treatment, if I change my sampling points, I have to get that authorized and notarized too. If, for instance, I'm using a polyphosphate and I stop, that's something else that has to be. Am I getting close to the lunchtime? Seeing several people looking at watches now. All right. If I modify the existing treatment, I must also notify and get their authorization on that. For instance, if I switch secondary disinfectant in order to reduce my TTHMs or my halyacetic acid, I got to notify and get their approval for that. For coagulants, now do you all use any coagulants? Because you're on groundwater right now, so it may not be an issue. But when you go to the microfiltration, some type of coagulant may be necessary.
Yeah, we're not using any chemicals
At the moment.
yeah.
Yeah. When you get that plant up and running, you're going to have to make sure you take out as many turbidity particles as possible prior to running that water through. So a lot of your filtration, membrane filtration techniques employ some type of coagulation prior to sending that water to the filter. So that may be something that will be incorporated in your treatment. And if you switch corrosion inhibitor products because it's just not working for you, again, notification approval before doing that. It's a lot of reporting, and what you will find is that any type of government work you're dealing with, and if it's not written, it wasn't done, you better be able to find that piece of paper with those analysis and results and why you did what you did. Okay. If not, you're going to be doing a whole lot more. Source water monitoring, remember this was another component of the lead and copper rule. The results within 10 days following each monitoring period. Now, failure to collect from your specified sites must be accompanied with an explanation why. Why did you change points, sampling points? And it can't just be, well, Floozy kept giving me positive, so I had to find another home. You have to be able to explain why. Did I get his name all wrong there, huh? Yeah. Yeah, it has to be some type of explanation to.
Most times we change sites. The house that we previously sampled from has been abandoned.
Vacant, yeah.
Yeah, family moved.
And that's an excellent reason there. And the other thing I want to point out, when you're developing your sampling site, always give the state more options. In other words, if they're asking for 60, give them 70. And that way I don't have to go back and get it approved. I have these other 10, there's always an option I can go to those sites. So always give them more than what they require, and that way you don't have to go back each time to ask for permission, so to speak. All right, now for corrosion control treatment. Now, once we've identified we have a problem, the state says you will do something to reduce the lead and copper. So, their recommendation for optimizing corrosion control, we have to make sure that we're able to demonstrate the optimization and that we can evaluate our results that we get and the effectiveness of the corrosion control. In other words, I can't just say I'm going to feed polyphosphate and it's not based on any type of dosage, and I'm not doing the residual or the analysis. You got to make sure you're doing the data backup there. Accompanied by a letter certifying the system has completed installing whatever treatment you've told your primacy agency you're going to install. All of that must be reported. We talked about the surface source water reporting. Now here's the key with this. You have to have a letter certifying that you've completed installing the treatment designated by the state within 24 months, whatever they say that is. Usually that's the timeline that they give you, 24 months to get it done. And once you get it done, you got to have a certified letter stating that. Okay, with your lead service line replacement, keep in mind that I told you initially when the law went into effect, EPA says that if you had a problem, you had to physically remove or replace 7% of your lead service line on a minimum of an annual basis there. And you got to make sure that you're documenting and you're reporting that back to the state or EPA also. So when your system exceeded the action level, no later than 12 months after the monitoring period, you have to demonstrate that you have conducted the material evaluation, you know where your lead service lines are, and that you've scheduled to replace that minimum of 7%. Did you all have to do any line replacement initially that you can remember? Don't have any. Cool. Okay.
We're all, what are we, PE?
PE, the polyethylene, okay. And polyvinyl chloride, PVCs.
Do we have any other?
So your homes, you're telling me a lot of your homes were built when you say that? Okay, so a lot of replacement because of weather. Okay, got you on that. Super. Okay, record keeping. Now all this stuff that we keep telling you that you got to report. Not only do you have to report, but you got to retain records. 12 years for lead and copper. 12 years for lead and copper as far as your retention. When you're doing the public education, make sure you're providing the list of all newspaper, radio stations, television station facilities where the notice was delivered. And they have to keep running that notice until, again, your numbers are back within range and it can be lifted. Okay. All right, now the action level for lead, 0.015, for copper is 1.3 parts per million or milligrams per liter. When the levels are exceeded at the 90th percentile, the following is required, and that's the water quality parameter monitoring there. And we talked about that. Again, you're doing those WQP samples at least on a 6-month basis or every 2 weeks, based on whether it's the tap or the entry to the distribution systems. So I won't regurgitate that. And your book just follows this in very detailed language there. For corrosion control treatment, large systems will not be able to get out of this. It's a must for them. It must be completed. However, small and medium system, only if required by the state. They could require you to do a study. So small, medium-sized systems, they get a little more leeway than the larger systems. And then the system has 24 months to install whatever treatment technique they install. How often do we monitor groundwater systems
Every 3 years.
and surface water systems?
Every year.
Every year, very good. Okay. And that's for source watering, again, monitoring, and that can also be reduced. Public education may be necessary, as well as supplemental monitoring, especially if you've exceeded the 90th percentile. And the content of the written information is provided by EPA. My suggestion, cut and paste. Why reinvent the wheel? When you reinvent the wheel with your own language, now you have to go through the process of getting that approved by your primacy agency. So
They
you
have templates.
you have yes, they do.
Our challenge is that we have to have it in our language.
Yes. Whenever you have a preponderance of people or the population of a certain, again, background where it's not English, you want to make sure you're providing. So you have to hire translators to do it in order to put it in that language. But still, even with that, I think cut and paste is good. Translate what they already have there, but then there may be some language issues there where the translation is not just the same, so you may have to go back through that process. Huh? There's some big words there. So you'll have to go back through the process of getting whatever statement you develop approved prior to notifying the public of that. Within your public education that's required, you want them to know what are the effects of exposure to lead and copper, what are the sources of lead and copper, and primarily we've established the source would be your plumbing. Tell the consumer how to get their water tested, and you want to make sure you're posting this in places that are frequented by women and children. You have to certify that you've made at least a good faith effort, at least 3 attempts. In other words, 3 places you're going to post this, or 3 different medias that you're going to utilize to get the word out. And one of the things that's just good, I think, being a good neighbor, if you've utilized my house as one of your sampling points, that you give me the results. That's just being a good neighbor there. Okay. If you need to replace in a lead and service line, which you don't, so this is not applicable. So I'm going to bypass this because it was not an issue for you. You don't use any type of corrosion control. Not an issue for you. So I'm at the end of my line. Are there any questions, comments? Oh, now I'll wait until he finishes doing that.